And when I asked David what he saw, it was something totally different. And so I know exactly what you're talking about.
This thing had been carved out and terraced long time ago. Like,
it just didn't fit. Like, the two Camorras just did not fit. The text, it didn't fit the history, it didn't fit my heart.
Welcome into another Key of David podcast here on Zion Media. As many of you know, we just got back from Missouri. And I will tell you, it's the first time that I've ever been to Missouri. And boy, was the energy interesting. And I'll leave it at that. But we had a great time out there. Huge shout out to Burroughs Ranch for hosting us. Incredible. Thank you to Phil, to his team. The amphitheater was incredible.
Beautiful.
The people we met, unbelievable. And a huge shout out to all of you who chipped in to cover the airfare for Chief Mitiga, to cover the cost of putting on the event. Huge shout out to Robert Mums, I believe I'm saying his name correctly. He showed up. And David, who was the other guy with the gray hair? Is his name Larry, or what's his name?
It was Todd Thorin. Yeah.
Huge shout out to these guys. I mean, full on, perfect production. Trevor kept telling me, Shane, this is 10 out of 10. This is 10 out of 10. This production quality is 10 out of 10.
And the crazy thing is, I told a couple of people, they're like, you guys must be going crazy. The truth is, besides booking the venue, it was very little effort on our part. We literally just showed up and everything was set up. It was amazing.
It was amazing. Couple announcements. Again, mark your calendars, December 21st. There will be an event here. We lost Dave. I don't know where Dave went, but Dave will come back on. Our event, December 21st, here in Salt Lake City. It looks like we'll probably be at the depot in downtown Salt Lake. I've got to confirm everything, but that's tentatively where we're at. I promise you we're going to have some amazing speakers, but my friend Alex Boyer has agreed to come and perform. And I'm going to see if I can get my friend Casey Elliott with Gentry to have Gentry come and perform as well. So stay tuned. It's going to be a lot of music. It's going to be a celebration of our Savior Jesus Christ. We're getting close to that's Christmas time. So I'm excited for that event. So mark your calendar. We've also booked a second retreat out to the Morel Ranch the first weekend of June. And so more details will be coming out about that. We have Zion Con April 3rd and 4th. So a lot of things. Now you'll notice I am dressed up right now. I was running.
You look good, dude.
Yeah, I was at the temple and I ran in. I had a question for a member of the temple presidency. And it happened to be somebody that knows my family and knows my dad really well, went to high school with my uncle, and I knew from his last name, I already knew. And I asked him a question. And I said, hey, I was sitting in the endowment and, Satan tells us to put on the apron. And I want to make sure that I'm not following Satan. And so I asked him that question. I got an answer, by the way. And so it's really cool that you can go to the temple presidency if you have questions about the endowment and get some answers. I also need to clarify something that I've said on this podcast. I have said on multiple occasions that I feel bad that I covenant to live the law of consecration and then I leave the temple and I don't live it. And I went to the temple with David and I don't know, maybe a week ago we went to Bountiful Temple, and it says that we're not covenanting to agree to live the law of consecration. We're covenanting to accept the law of consecration. So there's like these words that you got to pay attention in there. And so, yes, I accept to live the law of consecration when called upon. And I'm going to try to make as much money as I possibly can so that I can be helpful in helping anybody. And so my mission is Jacob 2:18 and 19. That's what I follow. I haven't always followed that. But today, that's where I stand on that. Okay, with all that.
Wait. What is Jacob 2? I don't even know what that is off the top of my head. You expect us to know that?
Jacob 2:18 and 19 basically says, seek first the kingdom of God first, and then if you seek riches, you shall obtain them. But as long as you seek them to obtain those riches to clothe the naked, feed the hungry, administer to the sick and afflicted, then riches can abound. And so that's where I'm at. I used to want to be the Forbes 400 richest, one of the Forbes 400 richest men in America, just because. And I'm telling you, that's not the right motive, right? That kind of could send you to prison. I know somebody that happened to, so be careful. Anyways, I am joined by David the Lion Douglas and my other co-host Trevor the Key Keys, and just want to give out to both those guys. I mean, this podcast just started out as something fun to do, and it's turned into a community, almost a family. And my wife we were at Morel Ranch. My wife feels like she's gained some big sisters out there. And so it's just really cool to see us all kind of coming together. I'm also joined by Lance Weaver, who you guys know. He's been on the program, and I am honored that we have on our show Jonathan Neville. Now, for me, as you know, I don't care if the Book of Mormon took place on another planet. You could tell me that it took place on Jupiter, and I'd still believe it the same. But I understand that many people want to know where it took place in this area. And I'm starting to become converted to the idea that it definitely did take place here on this planet. And I'm learning lots of different things from guys like Lance, and we're joined by Jonathan Neville, who I have huge respect for. I mean, there are so many people that have talked to us about Jonathan Neville, and I'm like, for a 4-month-old podcast, I'm really honored to have a guy like Jonathan Neville joining us, talking about these things, because I'm like many of you, right? And even the the guy in the temple presidency, was telling him about this podcast, and he said, "Shane, it's the Heartland." So I can see that there are lots of people that are exploring this. I think it's good to explore that. I think that we should ask questions. I think that we should search these things. And I see a day, as in DNC, I think it's 121 verse 24, 28, where nothing shall be withheld from them.
Right.
I think we're getting there. And the more we talk about this, the more we explore these things, the more nothing shall be withheld. So with that, Lance, welcome to the show. And Jonathan, man, welcome to Zion and the Key of David podcast. Thank you for joining us. As we jump in, for those of you who don't know Jonathan Neville, would you mind just giving us your background, who you are, and your journey in understanding the, Book of Mormon geography?
Okay. Well, I'm retired now, but I was a lawyer and a businessman and an author, and I did educator. I did lots of different things in my career. But what happened for me to get involved with this was, some years ago, I'd written a novel about Native Americans and the way that they could reclaim their tribal lands under the various treaties. And someone read it who was a friend of Rod Meldrum. And I had never met Rod Meldrum, but he said, "You need to meet Rod Meldrum and talk about all this stuff." And so I said, okay. So we went to one of his conferences, and this mutual friend introduced me. And in talking with Rod, he said, "Well, if you want to understand all this stuff, you need to come on a tour to Ohio." And because of my business and other things, I've been all around the world, but I'd never been to Ohio really. And so I went on this tour with him and Wayne May to Ohio, and got to know those guys pretty well. And they totally changed my perspective, because I had been fascinated by Book of Mormon archaeology and anthropology for pretty much my whole life. And I'd been to Central America, and I took a class at BYU from John Sorensen, and I knew Jack Welch from law school and so on. And so when I went to Ohio and these guys showed me this new perspective, I was just fascinated with it. And I asked Rod, "Well, this seems so obvious now to me. How do we ever get stuck with the Mesoamerican stuff?" And he said, "Well, there's these articles in the Times and Seasons from 1842. And everybody thinks Joseph Smith wrote them, but he was in hiding at the time, and lots of things were going on, so that seemed unlikely." So I decided to investigate those articles. That was the first church history research I did. And that led me to conclude that it wasn't Joseph Smith who wrote those articles, and that's a whole another conversation. But the next phase was, well, if it did take place in North America, how does the Book of Mormon describe North America? And my wife gave me a list of all the Book of Mormon geography passages. I think there are around 300 of them. And so I just started going through them methodically with two assumptions. And I approached it kind of like a scientific experiment, I guess. I said, the one pin in the map is the Hill Camorra, New York, because that's been pretty obvious and widely taught and so on. And the second was a little more theoretical, but still supported in the scriptures, which was Zarahemla was across from Nauvoo in D&C 125. And so using those as a hypothesis, I went through the entire Book of Mormon and did a kind of created different maps and was figuring it all out and so on. And that's what I ended up publishing that as the book Moronize America. In fact, just this last weekend, we issued a second edition. And I have this is what it looks like. This is a second edition of Moronize America. That's the book that discusses the geography. And so from there, I still wasn't satisfied, and I had more questions about church history, and I ended up writing, I don't know, around 10 different books on different topics of church history. So that's my background. I've written lots of books from a legal perspective to legal commentaries and stuff earlier in my career. And now I live on the Oregon coast, and I'm basically an artist most of the time. So,
what kind of art?
Well, I do mostly oil painting. I do some watercolor, but I do landscapes and portraits, and I've done some church history paintings, some Book of Mormon paintings. But I haven't released them because I did one show. I had one entry in a show, and someone bought it immediately, and they told me they could have sold it every day because everybody wanted it, and I was a little intimidated because I didn't have any catalog really of paintings. And so I wanted to develop at least 100 paintings before I did shows. And so I'm pretty close to having that now. Oh, this is the Amazon page. Okay.
Yeah, we want to make sure that, hey, check out his stuff. Lance loves his stuff. And if Lance loves his stuff, that means it's really good, because Lance is like, I don't know, next level.
I have a high bar, and Jonathan is an amazing researcher. Like, so good.
Yeah.
Great talk.
How many books do you have there? I'm seeing like 14.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. Well, what happened is when I was in law school, one of my professors kept trying to call me. Back then, we didn't have cell phones, and he was calling my house and leaving messages, and I was afraid I'd failed the class or something, you know. And what it turned out was he was writing these legal commentaries, and he wanted me to help him write and edit those. And that's what, when you were going through those list of books, some of them were called legal lines, and that's what those were. And they were mostly legal commentaries for law students. And so I ended up writing about 30 or 40 of those on different legal topics. I did 5 different ones on constitutional law, for example, and I did them on contracts and so on. And when I left law school, my first job was I was a law clerk to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of New Mexico down in Santa Fe. And so my job there was to help the justices write opinions. You know, people would do oral argument, we'd have to make notes and then write opinions. And I ended up writing a lot of the opinions because I was so used to writing legal commentaries that they would have me do the first draft and then other people would comment on it. And so I continued doing these legal commentaries for around 20 years, I guess, something like that. So it just became the habit, I guess, not a habit, but a practice to do writing every night for these legal books. And when
Amazing.
Then I wrote some novels.
What kind of law did you practice?
Corporate mostly. Well, okay, I can explain that a little bit. After I left the Supreme Court, I went into the Air Force because I talked to a prominent attorney in Los Angeles, and he said that was the best thing he ever did, because when you go in the Air Force as a JAG, you're immediately doing trial work and all this investigation, that kind of stuff. And he said that's the best thing he ever did, so I should do that if I wanted to work in a big law firm. So I did that. We went to Germany. And while I was in Germany, I've mentioned this in one of my books, I was a criminal defense lawyer for a while. And one of my clients tried to murder me. It's a long story. We don't have time to get into it, but he stabbed me in the back, and he did nearly kill me. But as a result of that, his knife went into my spine. I had a near-death experience. The whole thing was amazing.
Holy cow.
And I lost all feeling from my waist down, and it was just this crazy thing. But after that, my wife said, I don't want you doing any more trial work or dealing with criminals. And so I shifted from that into more corporate stuff. And I did corporate law for most of the time. And then
Amazing.
I had some companies that we started and sold, and had a computer animation company, for example. That's one of the reasons I did a lot of travel around the world, because we did projects on every continent, basically. Except for, we didn't do any projects in Antarctica, but we did visit Antarctica on an expedition down there. So I've always been interested in antiquity, because when I was a kid, we lived in Germany, and we took a trip down to Greece. Our family did. And we went to visit Mars Hill. And my dad said, well, this is where the Apostle Paul preached to the Athenians. And I didn't have any idea what he was talking about. Of course, I was like 15. But he showed us in the Bible, and I read those passages in Acts, and I thought, well, this is awesome. I'm standing where the Apostle Paul was. And all of a sudden, the scriptures meant something to me for the first time, really, as a kid. And ever since then, I've always been a little obsessed with going to the places that are discussed in the scriptures. You know, I've been to Israel several times. We led a tour on the travels of Paul, and in Greece and Turkey, and you know, I've been to the Isle of Patmos. All those things you read about, I visited for myself, because I want to know for myself, and that's what led me to go to Central America when I was younger as well.
Can I ask, before you move off that,
Sure.
How was the Isle of Patmos? Can you tell us a little bit about your experience and what you saw out there?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I have lots of pictures. I don't have those ready to show right now, but it's one of the Greek islands, and they're all pretty much kind of desert islands. They don't have a lot of trees, because the Greeks cut all the trees to build ships in antiquity. But it's a beautiful setting. You know, when you picture a Greek island with all the white houses that you see in the blue ocean, that's what the Isle of Patmos is like. But they have a cave there. Well, there's a monastery and, you know, lots of kind of Catholic buildings, Orthodox buildings. But they have a cave where the tradition is that's where John the Revelator received the revelation and recorded it. And you go in there and they kind of show it, and you know, who knows how real that is, but it's pretty cool to at least be on the island where he was.
Wow. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Trev, do you want to kind of take this over and walk through kind of the format, and let's jump into the Book of Mormon geography? And your lighting's not great. I don't know why.
No. I literally just ran, as he was talking about Patmos, I ran and grabbed a lamp.
Oh, nice.
I don't know what's going on with the lighting here. Yeah. Okay. So just kind of origin story. And by the way, I love origin stories, and your being there in Greece was your origin story, literally, Jonathan.
Yeah, it
right?
was. Mm-hmm.
That just lit something inside of you as a kid. That's really cool. I love hearing stories like that. So our origin story of how we all got here is Lance. Lance has this continental model, as many of you know. And if you don't know and you're seeing this for the first time, Lance is a geologist. I'll probably stumble over exactly, you know, his full credentials. But in this process, Lance has access to all these tools and software. And he started with a similar passion, wanting to understand where all this took place, and started putting pins all over the U.S. Anywhere there was an archaeological find, he started pinning it. And then he started going into the Book of Mormon, and anywhere there was a reference of geography, you know, they went northward, the sea westward, all that stuff, started putting pins in. And I think a lot of us can resonate to that, because I tried at a first grade level to do something like that on Google Maps. And it was funny. Lance says, I have a map with all of these pins, and I wanted to share mine until he opened his. And I'm like, I can't find mine. I don't know where mine's at. But the thing that I loved about Lance's model is it's not a model of division. It's not a model. And you know, in Third Nephi, you know, when Christ came back, you know, he told them that he didn't want disputations among them. Right. And it's the thing that I regret about the Meso and Heartland model is the disputations that it creates, right? And so in wanting to do this podcast, we wanted to make sure this wasn't a debate, right? We wanted to make sure this was a unifying conversation, and that we could share common interests. And really, Lance is so cool. He wants to talk to all these guys. He wants to have a conversation with Rod Meldrum and with Wayne May and with you. And we talked about this a couple of months ago. And he's like, I want to learn more. I want to learn from these guys. It'll help me make my model better. And so the entire goal of this is to be able to come on and my thoughts is allow Lance 10 minutes or so to kind of give a 30,000-foot view for people who haven't had a chance to catch up of all of Lance's model. And this is going to be really hard for Lance to do, or anyone to do in 10 minutes of saying, tell us what 10 years of your work is like in 10 minutes, right? It's super simple. It's kind of like the Kolob time, Lance. You got to take Kolob time and mash it down into our time. But give us a overview, Lance, of how your model pulls these two models together. And then from there, what we'd like to do is kick it back over to Jonathan. I know that you've got a few slides put together as well. We can kind of talk about that, and then we'll just let it go fluid from there and have conversations back and forth. Fun little anecdote on this is we're heading in a couple of weeks down to Monte Alban in Mexico, and we're heading down to Teotihuacan, visiting some of those sites, meso sites, those would be considered. Lance has a hypothesis that Monte Alban might be Nephi's temple in Second Nephi. And so we're really excited to go down and check that out. But yeah.
I want to make a quick comment, Jonathan, and we've talked a couple times, I'm just going to say that I would have never seen myself going to Mexico for a single thing if it wasn't for
David feels like a heretic. He's like,
yeah, I know, a little bit.
I promise I haven't changed sides completely.
Yeah, I'm here. Like, I've made videos about you, Jonathan, supporting what you said, and here I am, literally. Yeah. So just to
Hey, well, along these lines, let me just mention my tagline that I use all the time, which is clarity, charity, and understanding. Have you heard me talk about that before?
I have now.
Okay. Well, I have my other book over here. It's called the Rational Restoration, and it says reframes in the pursuit of clarity, charity, and understanding. And the whole thing I'm trying to say there is that in order to have no more contention, those are the three principles that you follow. And it says nothing about arguing about it or convincing or persuading. It's just, first, let's be clear about what everybody believes. Second, have charity, because we assume everybody's acting in good faith, right? And then the third is understanding, because we just want to understand one another, not try to persuade one another. And it's, when I first got involved in this, because of the way they had been treating Rod Meldrum, the Meso guys have been really critical of him in the past. And they were kind of, in my view, kind of abusing their credentialed class status because he didn't have a college degree and they did. And so I was kind of outraged by that. And I was kind of acting as a lawyer, a defense lawyer, trying to defend Rod and, being attacking. But I realized people don't change their minds when they're attacked, right? And I don't even care if they change their mind. I'm fine with people believing whatever they want. But I've realized that if we can reach the point of clarity, charity, and understanding, then there's no reason for any contention. Yeah. All the contention arises
Say that one more time. Those three things, I need to write them down.
Okay, clarity, charity, and understanding. Those are the three principles.
And yeah, we could adopt that at Zion Media. That's great.
Yeah, well, and my website I mentioned about How to Zion talks about that as well.
But clarity, charity, and
clarity, charity, and understanding.
2 C's and a U. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. And the point is that all contention arises from a compulsion to try to persuade someone to change their mind. Otherwise, there would be no contention. If we didn't feel compelled, I got to have someone agree with me, if it wasn't for that, there would be zero contention in the first place. And so that's why I focus on understanding one another instead of trying to persuade one another. And for me, it's completely liberating. I mean, obviously, I couldn't do that as a lawyer. I'd never win a case, right? But in terms of the gospel, you have to recognize that people have different perspectives, different backgrounds, different priorities, and all that stuff. And it's, President Oaks and others of the apostles have talked about unity and diversity.
How do you shift that mindset from an attorney that is all about, hey, I got to convince a jury that this, and then how do you change that, go from that kind of a mindset to this mindset of clarity, charity, and understanding?
Well, I'd say there's two things. One is humility, because I don't have every answer to everything. So how can I tell someone else they have to believe what I believe, right? I just want to understand where they're coming from. And for me, it's fascinating. A couple of years ago, my wife was working on an online master's degree in psychology. And so I was one of her experimental subjects. she would try different tactics on me to see how I would respond and stuff. And it really was fascinating to learn more about psychology and how people think and what they respond to and the stimulus and motivations and all that stuff. And as I explored that with her and also on my own, I realized that people are so different, they literally cannot see the same thing. Some people call it two movies on one screen, where you're both looking at the exact same facts and you come away with different impressions of it, right? Even in the Bible, Christ would perform a miracle, and some people would say he had a devil, and some people would say he was the Son of God, and they were looking at exactly the same events.
Well, I'll tell you, to illustrate this point, I was literally taking David Douglas home yesterday, and we saw a big semi-truck pass by, and it said super ego. And I asked David, what does that mean to you when you see that? And what he saw and what I saw, two totally different things.
Right.
On this, like, super ego for me is like, make sure you don't get a super ego, beware of pride. And what David saw was something to, like, I was thinking, okay, that's a sign from God to remind me that just because you drive a fancy Porsche and you're no better than anybody else. In fact, you're probably worse. So make sure you don't get a super ego. And when I asked David what he saw, it was something totally different. And so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's right. And, I've had discussions we can get into this on missionary work, how missionary work works. But if you've been on a mission and you talk to a lot of different people, every one of them has a different reaction and a different background, different understanding. I've talked with Muslims and Hindus. I've spent some time in India, and I can tell you those stories too, or in China. In fact, before we start talking, we talked about my shirt where it says Brigham Young University in Chinese. So in China, it's a completely different worldview as well, not just about religion, but about everything. And so I just figured there's no point in trying to convince everybody to agree with me about anything. So I just abandoned all that. And again, as you asked about being a lawyer doing that, it's liberating to not feel like you have to persuade people about stuff. And there's just zero contention. I mean, I don't have any contention with anybody about anything. I just say, I'm interested in what you believe, how you came to that conclusion and why. And that's awesome for you, whatever. And here's how I believe it, and I think that's really kind of how the missionary work is supposed to proceed anyway. We just bear testimony. We don't try to argue with people about it. So
just share your truth. And if everyone's sharing their truth, and then you build upon that truth back and forth.
Absolutely.
And eventually you add on to the truth more and more.
Yep. That's right.
I think that highlights why I've really, really been an admirer of you and Rod's work. Ever since I started having my dreams after my mission 20 years ago, I mean, I've eat, breathed, and everything's been about Book of Mormon geography and geology and how it relates to the scriptures, But I know that early on, I definitely perceived that there was like this arrogance around the kind of BYU academia. And the way that they kind of discounted all of this amazing truth and evidence, especially in the quotes of Joseph Smith and his beliefs, right? They completely, not only did they kind of like neglect it, they almost like poo-pooed it, like looked down on it in a way that I found distasteful. And it was kind of like, and the whole two Camorra theory, like my truth, because I was studying things out carefully even at a young age, was that it just didn't fit. Like the two Camorras just did not fit the text. It didn't fit the history. It didn't fit my heart. Didn't fit my testimony of the Book of Mormon as I read it. I mean, my first model of the Book of Mormon I made when I was 15, and I sat down and I read the whole book in one day, and created my own little model, because even though I had no clue about anything, but it was like, as I got through my mission, I was just like devouring all this information. I'm like, what on earth, two Camorras? This does not ring true. Like this is not, I can't even see it. It's not here. And so when I saw, and it was so pervasive. So then when I saw you guys starting to gain traction, in the early 2000s, I was so excited about that, because it's like it had to arise. Somebody needed to come and fill that space, because I know I wasn't alone in realizing, like, in having a heart that just said, no, the two Camorras does not fit. Like that is not, it doesn't ring true to me. And somebody needs to champion the idea that no, let's just believe Joseph Smith. Like, let's believe Joseph Smith. All these quotes about the hills of the Nephites, all these quotes about Zelph, about Camorra itself, about the record room. Why not just believe him? Like, what is it about somebody who and I don't even know who the first person who's like, well, they couldn't travel very far. Even though the final Exodus took 60 years, right? And the Saints took 30 years to move from New York to Kirtland to Nauvoo to Far West to Salt Lake, like 2,500 miles in 30 years, building a bunch of towns on the way. The final Exodus of the Nephites was 60 years. And so in 60 years, we're saying, oh, they weren't just facing persecution like the Saints. They were like running for their lives. They knew their wives and their kids were going to be totally genocide, like Holocaust style, So they just went 200 miles like that. That to me was always like so crazy. I just couldn't even quite fathom that. Like, why would they invent two Camorras? And I've devoured all of your stuff. Obviously, I love the way you speak. I love all your research. But every time I've heard you from early years speak about the two Camorra cartel, even though it's a little tongue in cheek, it's kind of ring true. I saw it. It's like there is kind of like this feeling of arrogance around it, with a theory that isn't very solid. You can kind of afford to be arrogant on something that's super solid, but something that like there's really not any evidence for it anyway. And for them to for so many of them to totally poo-poo you and Rod's ideas and be like, there's no evidence of that final battle in New York and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, there isn't evidence of Veracruz either. Like almost everything you guys are like condemning these Heartlanders for, you're guilty of. So where's that coming from? Let's just all get together and anyway. I want to hear you talk more about that idea too, and about your experience, kind of getting that pushback and of like not feeling the two Camorra idea as well.
Well, boy, there's a lot to say on that topic for sure. Because as I mentioned, I had a class from John Sorensen when I was at BYU, and then when I was in Santa Fe working for the Supreme Court, he had sent around an early draft of his book on an ancient American setting for the Book of Mormon. And a friend in my ward was an archaeologist there in Santa Fe. And so John sent it to him as part of the peer review. And this guy knew that I was interested in it. So he and I went through the whole manuscript. Back then it was just a photocopy, I guess, but it was, loose pages. It was pre-publication. And I was totally convinced by it. I thought, oh, John Sorensen, first of all, he's an awesome archaeologist, anthropologist, and he's gone through all this detail. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that book, Ancient American Setting, but it was really the first detailed archaeology book. And so I was convinced, and like I say, until even on my mission in France, I bought a book on the Mayans, and I used it in presentations and to prove the Book of Mormon, so to speak. And so I was all in. And then, as I mentioned, when I met Rod, I thought, wait a minute, this makes more sense. And that's okay. Let's show that one again, Lance.
That's pretty fast.
That's the latest one. That's the Mormon's Codex.
Yeah, kind of part 2.
And that's the one that towards the end of that book, he says the idea that the Nephites left Mesoamerica to go all the way to Camorra is a witless sci-fi movie, those kind of things. And so, but I was all in, but I was also flexible. I still had an open mind, and that's why Wayne and Rod really opened my mind to this different approach. So the first thing I did was examine those 1842 Times and Seasons articles, because those had always been the justification for the Mesoamerican setting from the early days of the church. Actually, I don't know how much in the weeds of history you want to get into, but the first one who came up with the two Camorras theory was this guy named Lewis E. Hills. He was an RLDS scholar.
Yeah, I heard that.
And in the late 1800s, early 1900s, he and a guy named Stebbins were getting together trying to figure out where Camorra is. And in 1917, this L.E. Hills published a map showing Camorra in southern Mexico. And that's the one that Joseph Fielding Smith denounced and so on. We don't need to get into all that, but he just concluded that Oliver Cowdery was speculating. Joseph Smith was speculating. They didn't really know the geography of the Book of Mormon. And therefore, because of all these ruins in Central America, the Book of Mormon must be in Central America. But it was driven by these articles in the Times and Seasons. And so when I came up with my approach that it was Benjamin Winchester who actually wrote those articles, which is a whole podcast on its own.
Yeah.
So the first thing I did was I met with some of the scholars at BYU about this. And it was a whole new idea to them. And at first they were a little bit interested until they realized the implications, which was that if it wasn't Joseph Smith who wrote those articles, then we shouldn't be using those articles. And that was the whole premise for their Mesoamerican setting. And so I had written kind of a short outline of it, and I met with some emeritus general authorities, and they were all excited about it. They wanted me to, we met with Sherry Dew at Deseret Book, and to have her publish this book, changing a whole approach to the times and seasons and so on. But Sherry told me it was going to take over a year to go through the correlation department to get this approved, because it was changing everybody's understanding. And one of the emeritus general authorities that was there said, every time the topic of geography comes up in our councils, everybody refers to these articles in the times and seasons. And the reason is that Joseph Fielding Smith had put those in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, those articles. And so everybody grew up with the idea that Joseph had written these articles. And that was the whole premise for the Mesoamerican setting.
Yeah. I mean, maybe in combination to other things,
Well, that was the premise for it, though. That's why they looked there. And then from there, they developed a whole, structure around that. But if you look at what Mark Allen Wright and even the Sidney Sperry and those guys, they were all talking about these articles. Joseph Smith said these were the ruins of the Nephites. Therefore, we have to figure how that works.
Yeah.
And so the reaction to me, though, getting back to your question, the reaction to me was very antagonistic. The first thing they did was they wrote articles in the Interpreters talking about how stupid I was and I missed this, that, and the other. And we actually had a little bit of a debate at the John Whitmer Historical Association, where it was me and, I won't use names, but one of the Meso guys were on a panel together. And my point was that Joseph Smith, even though he's listed as the editor and the printer and the publisher of the Times and Seasons, it was just a nominal position. He wasn't actually setting type. He wasn't running the printing press, and he wasn't actually editing anything. And during the conversation on this panel, my opponent actually said, well, Joseph was a nominal editor, so he conceded my point. But they were still very antagonistic. And, I had lots of critics online and so on. And to me, that's just all part of the fun, because as a lawyer, you love having those kind of adversaries and stuff.
Right.
If you didn't have adversaries, then, what are you doing?
Yeah.
But some of them got really outraged and exercised about the whole thing. And so I think now pursuing this idea of clarity, charity, and understanding has diffused all that argumentation.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy to me, like, even going, I was at a legal proceeding not too long ago for a neighbor, and it was crazy to see how you have two different people who have completely different realities telling their version of the story. And it just hits home. Like, I have an article on the Only True Church with that same idea, that it's like, how do you actually come to the truth? Like, how do you actually see the truth? Because everybody's view of something is so flawed. And I believe it's like, it really is. You have to have all these different perspectives, and you have to be able to combine those perspectives, and then you can actually see the truth. Like, there's no such thing as truth if it's from a single perspective, because truth, by its very, definition, is like a thing from every perspective. Like, the ultimate truth is seeing it from every different way,
Yeah, exactly. To some degree, truth is subjective, because we interpret, for us, the truth is based on our perceptions.
Yeah. And I want to kind of build on common beliefs and really steelman the Heartland argument a little more before we even get into anything else.
Sure.
And just go through some of these like really amazing things. Like, so let's talk for a second, like Camorra. I mean, how many different visions are there where they actually see within the Hill Camorra? How many instances are there where, of Lucy Mack really giving very specific quotes where Joseph, Oliver Cowdery, we've got lots of quotes, and I've assembled them and you've assembled them, where there's very specific ideas that this is Camorra, like that the record room is in this hill in New York. And so then it's like, well, man, there's a lot of dismissing of holy crap. It's like, you have to almost, and this is my contention for sure, you have to make Joseph Smith a fool.
Yeah.
If you put Camorra down south, you really do, at very least, if we're going to be the most charitable thing, you have to say, well, he had no clue, and he ran his mouth off in things that he didn't really understand. Like, you have
and that's what they say. Yeah, that he was speculating and doing the best he could, but then when he got to Nauvoo, and he read the Stevens and Catherwood books about Mesoamerica. He was learning about the Book of Mormon geography. That's their whole approach.
Yeah, and I was on a Book of Mormon forum, Facebook forum for years, and just had I thought it was so interesting, like because I was on both Heartland and the main Book of Mormon forum, and this kind of that was ended up getting run by what's his name, Sturgill, and Book of Mormon Central.
Right.
And I could not believe how anytime anybody posted something on the Heartland, the belittling comments. Like it wasn't just like trying to kind of like argue against him. They were belittling comments.
Yeah.
Like there was an arrogance there that did not exist in the Heartland group.
Right.
And I it's not to say that it isn't there, because I've gotten on my videos from Heartland people being like, you don't know what you're talking about, but it was far more pervasive and among not just the fringe, like trolls in their basement. It was like the some of the leaders of the group.
Oh, absolutely.
Were heading that kind of troll-like behavior of just really belittling the other group.
Well, the two most prominent Meso advocates are well-known scholars that take that approach.
Yeah, I mean, some of them for sure. I ended up getting kicked out of the group like a year ago.
I'm not surprised
because I totally called him out on it. And I got so tired of it. I called him out on it multiple times, and I'm like, do you see how your bias is so crazy? Like you'll take so much garbage from someone in your camp, but you won't take any garbage, any wrong missteps or things that are said wrong, in a way that it wasn't very great.
Yeah. Well, just so you know, they hate this idea of clarity, charity, and understanding. I've met with the people at Book of Mormon Central and gone through this, and they don't like it at all.
Yeah.
So,
I hate to generalize too much,
Jonathan,
but some of them.
How do we, as Latter-day Saints, like there is bickering inside of our own community, right? Like we're supposed to all be on the same team.
Right.
How do we ever create Zion if we can't at least see eye to eye and be okay that, oh, I just don't see it the same way you do, but that's okay?
Yeah. Well, we can't. And that's why, there's kind of, there's more than just two bifurcations in the church, but some people are so adamant about their own theories that they won't tolerate alternatives. Just like Lance just said. I mean, I hate to say it, but Scripture Central consists of people who only can have one point of view. I know people that they've offered jobs to, but in order to work there, they had to change their mind and accept the Meso stuff. And it's just it's perplexing, frankly, to me, because they purport to be scholars, but they're not open-minded at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. We all have wives, and it's like most of us. It's hard to have someone where you kind of have to see eye to eye with someone and not have conflict, and it's hard not to get divided over conflict, like because there's no way that we can like bring together people with different viewpoints without conflict. It's going to happen. But the hard thing is like, how can we then afterwards really, like, let's say that we were to have a podcast and we were going to have like Brant Gardner or like some of the real leaders, of each movement come together, and they're going to like, there would be conflict, there would be a debate, but then it's like, well, can we meet on common ground? Is there even any common ground between the two models? I mean, mine, I can easily do that. I can reach on both sides because mine encompasses both models in different ways, right? But yeah, it's really hard for people who think the whole thing happened here, the whole thing happened there, to not demonize the other side a little bit, right?
Well, yeah. Well, this is where having practiced law helped me, because you could be in court arguing as fervently as you can against the other side, but then you go out and have lunch together because you can compartmentalize. And so I have good friends that I have real strong disagreements with, and we're still great friends. We can go golfing together, go to the temple together, whatever, even though maybe politically or scientifically or whatever, we have stark differences of opinion. And it's, in a way, compartmentalizing is one psychological approach to it. The other is to just try to be more interested in what other people think, and not feel any compulsion to try to change their minds. And I don't need to get into examples, but the basic principle, again, comes back to this clarity, charity, and understanding. A lot of contention arises from a lack of clarity, because people think they disagree because of miscommunication or assumptions. And it turns out they really do agree. And if they're clear about it, they realize there's no reason to disagree. And then the charity thing is just assuming people are acting in good faith, even if they disagree with you.
I'm going to
the
throw
political
in.
realm. What's that?
Sorry. I was
Go
going to
ahead.
throw in a third C: clarity, charity, compartmentalization, and understanding.
Compartmentalization. Well, compartmentalization has kind of a negative connotation because it's like you're in denial to some degree. So I don't usually talk about
too, I guess.
compartmentalization. But I would look at compartmentalization as a step towards understanding.
There you go.
Yeah, that would help. But I didn't make it part of my 3 things because I didn't want people to focus on compartmentalization.
Well, let's jump in if you can share my screen,
Yeah.
Trevor, and I'm going to show. So I have basically my maps that I've made of different models are really my attempt to steelman and make the best possible argument for those models.
Yeah.
And so I want to show you my model that I've tried to make of the Heartland, where I've tried to encompass the necessary aspects. And I want to know how it differs from maybe your ideas, on how it might differ from Rod's ideas or Ryan's ideas. So anyway, yeah. So you can see here my land of Zarahemla, my land of Bountiful, my land of Nephi, and my land of Desolation. And maybe tell me some ways how you would see it differently, and then I'll tell you reasons why maybe I thought that this was the best fit for the text for a Heartland model.
Okay, I can, just looking at this, and I have watched your video somewhat. I didn't have time to watch the whole thing, but I have a sense of what you're doing. So my first comment is the land northward and land southward. I don't think those are proper nouns. I think those are relative terms. And so, for example, if you're down in, where did you say you are right now?
Cedar City.
Cedar City. Okay, so in St. George, Cedar City is the land northward, but in Provo, it's the land southward. So it's just a relative term. And that's how I interpret the entire Book of Mormon that way.
So
and
then
there are
where the majority of the Book of Mormon happens, below, like in Zarahemla or Nephi. Is there any instance where you think the land northward wouldn't be north of Zarahemla, or north of like the Narrow Neck or the Narrow Passes?
Well, the Narrow Neck is another topic.
Yeah, and I agree with you there.
I think
and go ahead. Why don't you go off for a second just on that, because we share an idea where it's like everyone thinks that the Narrow Passes are on the Narrow Neck, which they might be, but that isn't required by the text. And I believe that they're kind of separate from the Narrow Neck, and you do too. And so I'd love for you to kind of point out, what do you think some of your Narrow Necks and Narrow Passes are?
Okay, sure. So the first question most people ask me is, where's the Narrow Neck of land? And I always say Ether 1020, because that's the only reference in the Book of Mormon to it. And it was a Jaredite term that talked about their city. There's other passages that talk about a small neck of land and a narrow neck, and then narrow, as you mentioned, narrow passages. So those are different terms, and I think they refer to different things.
Yeah.
And so, I have a whole blog post, and actually in this new edition of Moronize America, I have a chapter on that, because I started looking at how those terms were used in Joseph Smith's time, and I looked at how George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and those guys were using those terms. And they specifically use those terms, a narrow neck of land or a narrow neck. And a narrow neck is usually referred to a waterway. And I think that's why they specified it was a narrow neck of land, it being different. And so when you look at how small those narrow necks were around the Boston area and Washington and so on, they're ubiquitous. There's narrow necks of land everywhere. And so I think we've kind of developed this whole hourglass shape for Book of Mormon geography that isn't required by the text and doesn't even really make sense. So in other words, those terms are open up almost infinite possibilities for locations. And I don't see it as one narrow neck that everything is based on. So when you say, is there a land northward north of the narrow neck? Yeah, definitely. Just like there is a land northward north of everywhere, and same with the land southward.
So when I make this statement, like in some of my videos, tell me if I'm like accurate when I say this, that with like John Sorensen, I think a lot of people like his model because he like has individual matches for individual places.
Right.
And my perspective has usually been that among the Heartland group, there's not so much focus on like matching really close individual cities, other than maybe Zarahemla and in some cases Nephi. There's not a lot of like focus on trying to match, like, this is one individual narrow neck, this is one individual narrow pass, this is one individual city, like, this is the city of Zeezrom, this is the city of Kumenai. Like, I've never seen that kind of detail in matches, and I don't think that it's really the focus of Heartlanders. Is that accurate?
Right. Yeah, and in fact, even Kirk Magleby admitted. He said, "Well, our basic assumption is that every city with a name is only one. In other words, there's only one name per city, or one city per name. So, for example, if there were two cities called, I don't know, say Jerusalem, then their whole model is blown away. And the text never says that there is only one name per city. And I'm saying that backwards.
I get what you're
the
saying,
text
yeah.
never says that there are unique names throughout.
Right. In some cases, there might be two. In fact, the church, even in the Bible dictionary, has that for Aaron, because there's some real complexities in the geography of Aaron. A lot of times they say, well, there must have been two Aarons, because in one case it says it's between Ammonihah and Nephihah, and then in another case it seems like it's down in the southwest, east, closer to the Amulek and Ammonite lands. And so then it's like, well, maybe there's two Aarons.
Example of that is, you think about how many Parises there are in the United States. Even a name as random as Nineveh. I was shocked when they were doing the eclipse radius. There's Ninevehs everywhere. That eclipse went through 9 Ninevehs in America,
Well, and even in the Book of Mormon, there are 2 land bountifuls, one in the old world, one in the new world. And so we know from there that they were using the same name for 2 different places. So the whole theory that there could only be one place per name is not justified by the text itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the problems with these models where they're trying to specify a particular spot. The other issue there is there's so many places that have been destroyed that don't even exist anymore. So to try to say that we can only find a Book of Mormon site if it still exists archaeologically is irrational also.
Right. We definitely shouldn't say anything has to be this or that necessarily.
Except for one, and that's, I don't know if you've seen my hat here.
Oh, you're a Trump guy. You're a Trump guy.
No, look what it says.
Letter 7, make Camorra great again. That's awesome.
So, 8 years ago, I made a whole bunch of these hats. What's that?
Jonathan, I got to tell you something about Camorra, making Camorra great again. Yeah. I'm getting involved in a project where we're building a golf course, and you know what we're going to call it? Camorra.
Really?
It's going to be 18 holes.
Sweet. Where is this?
Where's the record room going to be?
It's in Adam-on-Diamond.
Nice.
Oh, really? Oh, I love it. I love playing golf, so I'm looking forward to that.
Make Camorra great again. I love it.
You know what's funny about this hat, though? I made, I don't know, a few hundred of these hats back in 8 years ago when Trump ran the first time. And I had a golfing buddy who was wearing it, and people would come up to him and say, "What is Camorra? I've never heard of that before." Because, they weren't LDS people. But they sold hundreds of them out there in Palmyra at the bookstore.
That's a great way to get a conversation going about what is that? What is Camorra? That's brilliant.
That's right.
Make Camorra one again.
Yeah, it was cool. I should have probably done it again this year, but I don't have time to do that stuff.
Let's ask a couple of
anyway. So getting back to your land northward and land southward. So if you look at this, see, you identified land southward and land northward as a specific site, and I would say, other than along the coast in the south where there wouldn't be a land southward, the entire map is full of land south. You see, so that's one sea west, and then the sea west, and I think you've probably seen where I've said, well, there's 2 sea west, because at one point they referred to the sea west south, right?
Right.
You're familiar with that one?
Yeah.
And the third thing I would note is, I know in your commentary you were talking about there is no sea west, but in my view, the Mississippi River is, because Isaiah and Nahum both use the term sea to refer to the Nile River. So it makes sense that would be a sea, because the Hebrew term just referred to a large body of water. And it could be a river or an ocean or what we call a sea today, or even a large lake.
And I've heard you say that, and I like that better than people who say that the river used to come up before the time of Christ up into the Mississippi, or that the Gulf of Mexico extended, up into the Cretaceous Seaway, or up into the Gulf of Mexico, which doesn't work because there's a bunch of archaeological sites that radiocarbon date from before the time of Christ, and they wouldn't be able to exist.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. And so In fact, I was with an archaeologist one time. We were doing that site, at Zarahemla. I just visited that one, and he asked me about this Sea West thing, and I said, well, that's the way Isaiah and Nahum described it. And he got out his Strong's Concordance and looked it up, and he said, oh, you're right. And he gave me a high five, And then I was on a podcast with the Backyard Professor, Kerry Schertz, who's kind of a critic now. And this topic came up again, and his viewers are all saying, I didn't know what I was talking about that. So he went and got his Strong's Concordance and looked it up. And he said, Neville's right. That's exactly how it was used. So that's a kind of a new paradigm for people to think of a river as a sea, but it's right from the Bible. So
then the sea east is the Atlantic, the sea west is Nile. What is the head of Sidon? The sea west is the Mississippi River. Sorry, the sea west is the Mississippi River. What is the head of Sidon?
The head of Sidon, a head of a river can be two things. It could be the headlands or the headwaters, as John Sorensen always says, or it can be where rivers converge. And I've given lots of examples of that usage, but the one that I like the best is from Jonathan Edwards, actually. Are you familiar with what I've been saying about Jonathan Edwards?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so his son was on a mission to the Indians. Well, I should back up because your listeners may not know who Jonathan Edwards was. So Jonathan Edwards was a Christian minister, author, who lived in the 1700s. And he was, scholars say he was the most influential Christian theologian in American history. Some people even say he was the most influential person that led to the Revolutionary War because he was able to articulate kind of an American religion that was separate from the churches in England. But anyway, so his son was a missionary to the Indians, and he was writing letters about where his son was to people who were donating to the missionary cause. And it turns out he was along the Susquehanna River, and it was about 30 or 40 miles from Harmony, Pennsylvania, where Joseph and Emma lived when he was translating the Book of Mormon. And he talked about the head of the river, and it was the confluence of two rivers in, what's the town there? I'd have to think.
Near Allegheny in southern New York.
Yeah, Binghamton. It was at Binghamton. Yeah. And if you go to Binghamton, there's a park there where the rivers merge, and it's the head of the river. And so that's the common usage in Joseph Smith's day was the confluence of rivers where they joined together was the head of the river. And Oliver Cowdery even used that term once.
Yeah, I'd love if you had examples of those. I'd love you to send them to me because I tried to look that up and it kind of seemed like it was always talking about sometimes you have two rivers meet. So let's take for instance like the Colorado and the Gila. And like if one of them then kind of starts a new river's name, like the river changes name with the confluence, then you could call that the head because it's the beginning. But only if it like has to do with like a new name. But I guess my question would be if the Mississippi and the Ohio are the head of the River Sidon, so this confluence of these two rivers, the head of River Sidon, right? Then how is that also the Sea West? Because in one place we're calling it the sea, and in the other place we're calling it a river. Like they've already called it the river. If it's the River Sidon, how can it also be the Sea West?
Right. Well, as you know, even today they consider the lower Mississippi a separate river from the upper Mississippi. And the way the Army Corps of Engineers designates where the rivers start and so on. And so there's that confluence, but there's also the confluence with the Missouri River and the Illinois River. There's lots of confluences any of them could be the head of the river. And the Tennessee River comes into the Ohio River as well. So to specify which one of those confluences was the head of the river is pretty much a flip of a coin because there's several of them along there.
Yeah, let's talk about some other things I love in the Heartland.
Yeah.
Like as far as like all of I have never heard you talk too much about the artifacts they've found with the Burroughs cave and all that kind of stuff. What are your thoughts on those? Because I think that stuff's actually pretty cool. Even though mainstream archaeology like kind of dismisses pretty much every artifact with Hebrew on it. I think that is like a little arrogant, honestly, especially since I've found really convincing like things that actually can't be dismissed because they're monuments that are so big.
Right.
You can't just like move them or anyway. What are your thoughts on a lot of those artifacts?
Well, okay, there's I would say 3 or 4 categories of them. There's the Michigan tablets, there's the Burroughs cave, There's like the Holy Stones out of Conshohocken that are in the museum in Conshohocken, Ohio. And then there are more pedestrian, I guess, artifacts that you find all over the Midwest and even up into upstate New York. And so just for your reader's background, Wayne May and I have gone on lots of places together that we haven't talked about publicly, because part of it is that some of these things are on private land that we have to get permission from the landowners to do excavations and so on. And part of it is because there's just so much that we don't want to confuse people. So he focuses on a few major things. But we've been to some amazing places. In fact, I was up in Wisconsin about 2 weeks ago. We had lunch together and talked about some more cool new stuff that he has that he's going to talk about at his June conference. So he doesn't want me to talk about. But have you ever, any of you been out to his place in Wisconsin and seen all his collections? I don't know if any of you have been out there.
So Wayne, did you guys go out there?
Key of David in the field, going to Wayne's house, Wayne's World. Party time.
Wayne's World. That's it. It is totally Wayne's World. He has an incredible collection. But there's, as far as the Michigan tablets, I'll just address that one, then come back to Burroughs Cave. Michigan tablets are ones that were found in Michigan in the 1800s, and there's a lot of controversy about them because many of them are obvious fakes. In fact, the guy's, I think it was his granddaughter who talked about how her grandfather or her uncle, I don't remember which it was manufacturing them from roofing shingles. And they were manufacturing these things so they could sell them. And that's a pretty common thing, forged antiquities. In fact, even the Museum of the Bible announced last week that 5 of their most valuable artifacts turned out they were forgeries. So it's very common to have forgeries of antiquities. But it's also not easy to distinguish between forgeries and real ones. For example, when I was in Lebanon, we were doing a tour with some archaeologists in Lebanon some years ago, which was an interesting story because it was dicey and Americans weren't supposed to go there and so on. But I bought a bunch of coins, and the archaeologist said, well, I can't tell if they're real or not. Some of them were obviously fakes. I broke one in half so I could see what it was made of, and it was kind of an alloy. But others look like they're authentic. And in order to know for sure, you have to do a metallurgical test and figure out how old the material is and so on. So it's very difficult. And these Michigan tablets are all engraved on slate, which is, I don't think they can date that. They can only date the material that's in some of the grooves and so on. And there's a long history of that. I think you guys did the video where Wayne was talking about those, didn't you?
Trevor, can you put us on the side?
I think I saw a video that you guys did of that from the conference.
We posted, the only thing we have of Wayne is from the Book of Mormon Ojibwe outreach with.
Yeah, that's where he was talking about the Michigan tablets there.
Yeah.
And so if any of your viewers haven't watched that, you should watch that because that's a far better explanation than I can give. And these tablets are still in the University of, I think it's the University of Michigan storage, and you can't see them. And it's a whole story. Wayne can talk about that better. But in my view, there were authentic ones that these guys were trying to copy. So that's on the Michigan tablets. The Burroughs Cave is much more murky because lots of people say they have stuff from the Burroughs Cave. And this is a cave in southern Illinois. And there's ongoing work being done on that right now that I can't really talk about. We'll see what happens with that. But the museums all around the United States and private collections are full of this material. Unfortunately, though, in the last 2 or 3 months, most of the museums have taken everything off of display.
Why?
And it's because there's a federal law called the NAGPRA, National Native American Protection Act. I can't remember the whole acronym. But the idea is that if you have Indian remains, you can't put them on display. And originally it was intended to prevent a display of skeletons, personal things. But recently the Biden administration interpreted it to mean any artifacts relating to Native Americans. They can only be on display if the tribal leaders approve it. But some of the older artifacts from the Adena and Hopewell have no current descendants. And so there's no tribal leaders that can give permission to show them. And so they just taken them all out of the museums. Fortunately, I know it sounds crazy and it's a whole long discussion we could have, but Rod and I have taken people on tours to these museums in Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Ohio, and everywhere. And you see hundreds of artifacts, and they've matched with Book of Mormon descriptions, head plates and breastplates and all that stuff, but they're all gone from the museums. And fortunately, I have hundreds of photos of them, and Rod does too. But he told me he just went on a tour, took a tour out there about 2 weeks ago, and walked into the museum, and all they have are placards describing what used to be there. So
that's crazy.
It's pretty wild.
Behind that, like we've done an episode on Smithsonian cover-up, right? And to me, you can go pretty conspiratorial of like what is the reason behind this, the secret hand behind it. The only thing that I can come to is like Satan is playing 3D chess and doing every single thing he can to discredit all of this information, make it hard to find, make it slippery unto us, right? Yeah. But I'm curious, you've been doing this so much longer than all of us, like, and I'm sure you've seen so many instances of this happening. What's behind it? Is there a concerted effort behind it? Is it manifest destiny? Is it like, what's behind it all?
It originated with the manifest destiny thing. It was because when I did that novel I mentioned early on that about the Native Americans reclaiming their land, I did a lot of research into the legal premise for taking the Indian lands. And the U.S. Supreme Court even justified it with the rationale that, well, we were bringing them Christianity so we can take their lands. That was in the 1800s, and that was the mentality. And so there's been sort of a degree, I guess, of guilt, maybe you could call it white guilt, among some of these academics where they say, well, we shouldn't have taken their culture, we shouldn't have, put their bones on display and so on. And so that there's that kind of a thread of it that you can sort of understand. It's maybe to some degree it's a fairness thing, but whether it's satanic or not, I don't know. To me, that's a little reading more into it than necessarily. Obviously, it's not favorable for the Book of Mormon evidence.
And what I mean
by their history.
Yeah, what I mean by satanic is not necessarily like in the occult aspect of it. But just like I see Satan as this master game planner, right? And anything he can do, like guilt, right? We know where guilt comes from. It's taught in the in the endowment session, hide, you're naked, right? So anything that he can do to put these stumbling blocks that allows us to not find these clues and put everything together. Put shame or doubt or concern in the fact that like, oh, there's no way that Egyptian document or artifacts could be here. All of these things to me, I just see as this master, because I'm a good strategist, I'm a good planner, right? But I would imagine that Satan is the master of it, and so I don't know. That's where I always go to him, like, dude, he is.
And that's a good explanation. That's fair because I used to do these tours with Rod. I only did 3 or 4 because I don't have the time, but pretty much everybody that would come on the tour was persuaded by what they saw. And like I was, I explained how I was a Meso guy until I went on these tours and saw it for myself, and then I started researching. And so now the tours are, I guess, I wouldn't say ineffective because you can still see the terrain and the earthworks and so on, but without the artifacts, it's far less compelling. And so all we have now are photos. And, I've been to, this whole thing started when I started exploring it. I used to live in Tennessee when I was a kid. And so I was very interested in going back to Tennessee. My wife and I took a trip down there. We saw some special exhibits of things, of statues, for example, that have been plowed up in fields all around Tennessee and Kentucky. And they brought them all together for a special exhibition. And it only was there for a few months, and then they're all dispersed again. You'll never see them again. But fortunately, we were able to attend these and see them. And these sculptures, they're statues really of stone, and they're big, and they have people. They're very sophisticated, but no one will ever see them again. And it could be. I mean, you could look at it in the sense that as more and more people are interested in the Heartland or North American setting, you call it, or even what Joseph and Oliver were teaching, the powers that be, let's say the dark powers, would not want people to see these artifacts that corroborate and confirm the Book of Mormon. So that's a legitimate approach. But from a more, let's say, scientific perspective or ethical perspective, you can kind of, even though I don't agree with the rationale, at least they have a rationale for withholding.
Well, I'll tell you, Mexico isn't doing that. They're doing the opposite. Sure. They're building hundreds of museums. Like, they are absolutely building up and building unbelievable websites that showcase every ancient codice. Like, they are reaching into their past and making it available to their people, which are Native Americans. Like, there are huge sections of Mexico that aren't even mestizos, right? They are absolute full-blood Native Americans, and they are completely unburying their entire cultural heritage. Whereas in North America, these I'm going to call them woke, white guilt people are essentially burying and further erasing Native American history. I don't know why they don't take these museums and say, okay, well, let's form a partnership with the reservation. We'll give you part ownership of it. But I think we'll see more and more of it taken down.
You have to realize too, in Mexico and in Central America, it's a major tourism draw. So it's a financial interest in doing that.
Well, it could be here too, if they just would give the Native Americans a little bit of ownership. But a lot of the Native Americans, for some reason, I know that there's conflicting ideas within the tribes themselves, and some of them are like, no, we don't want any of this on display, and whereas other ones, we do want them on display. Maybe we just want some ownership. But the ones who are working out seem to be the ones who are, let's just bury it all.
Lance, I've got a question that you could answer better, because I was my origin story is I found Sorensen's book in about 2006 or 7, and it was so exciting to me, seeing all these pins and everything. And finally, and I remember I just went over to my friend's house, and there's like 3 or 4 of us, and we just ripped out the map, and we're like, "There's a map." There's a map, and it was just like, here's the Naranaga land, here's everything. It was so cool. And my parents in about 2010 got invited over to someone's house, and they were talking about the Heartland, and they came back with like DVDs and stuff like that. And they brought them to me, and I told my parents, I'm like, don't go back, don't talk to these people. Like, these people are crazy. Right? And I just totally sandbagged it. And then I stumbled upon one of Wayne May's videos talking about these different copper tools and swords and stuff, and I was like, wait. And then I went down the rabbit hole. But one of the things that I'd like Lance to ask is the lack of sophisticated architecture and structures, and like city of Zarahemla, let's say, where Heartlanders are saying it's at, there's hardly anything there. And Lance, can you talk to that a little bit more, and maybe ask the right questions in that?
Because I mean, there's just so much amazing stuff with the Heartland, and I would love to at some point do like a podcast, because it's hard to even get into it, I think, if you don't have like a full 2 hours to sit down, like, for just one side to lay out all their stuff. And if I'm going to say here, if anybody hasn't seen, like, I think it was Quakey Media that you did the interview, where it's like an 11-part series, Jonathan, I hope that everyone will get on and just watch some of these really big ones where Jonathan's been able to talk for, an hour to 2 hours straight and just go over point after point after point after point after point. I hope everyone will go and check those out if they haven't already.
What's the name? Say it one more time. What's the name of the podcast, Lance?
Let me find it. Is it called Quakey Media?
Quick Media?
Quick Media.
Greg Mattson?
Yeah,
Greg Mattson. Yeah.
Oh, I love Greg Mattson.
Yeah, Jonathan's interviews on there are spectacular, because he's got all the time. Like, and I would love to do that, where I can really kind of milk some of those ideas more, because there's just so much fantastic research in there, right? And I one thing that Jonathan hasn't gotten into very much, and Rod's really hasn't even touched on very much, that I would love to sit down and do like an hour or two talking to them about, is just the ideas behind creationism. And I know that Rod is more into that, because of Dean Sessions and that, than maybe Jonathan is. But I love that stuff, right? I'm not a creationist. I don't believe the earth is 7,000 years old, but I love creationists. Like, I want to help them out. Like, honestly, I want to like give them at least, even though I'm not going to agree with or believe their timeline, I at least want to help them like make their model believable, because I think it would be so cool if the earth was only 7,000 years. I don't think there's any way possible. Like, it's not even imaginable. But I used to think that way. and it would be cool if it was true. And I still like have this like space in my mind where I'm like, that would be so cool if like something happened to like shatter my worldview and see that's like, holy cow, it really did. Like the more catastrophe that I find coming out in the Earth's past, right? Like the Younger Dryas event and all this stuff with the comet impacting. I love that stuff. It's like, whoa,
that's really interesting to know about you, Lance, that you want your worldview shattered.
That's the coolest stuff. I mean,
viewers.
I agree with you, Lance, on that one. That would be cool.
Yeah, it's spectacular. So we'll have to do a thing on that. But as far as Zarahemla, what's that, Trevor?
Yeah, structures, advanced structures in the Heartland.
Okay, well, I'll tell you a couple of my ideas, right? So this is another funny thing for where we have the pot calling the kettle black, because we have all of these, I call them Mayan land models, not Meso models, because northern Mexico is in Mesoamerica, right? Mexico City is in Mesoamerica, but their models don't really encompass that. Their models are all down in the Mayan lands, right? They're all south of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, right? Except for the final battle. And so they have, Sorensen's model has this town called Santa Rosa, which is now underwater, under a lake, just like Wayne's City of Nephi, under a lake. So we can't even study it anymore. But this Santa Rosa was like this tiny little town, right? I mean, it had like a maximum population of about 20,000 people. And that is their Zarahemla, right? And so Zarahemla is the capital of a land that was amassing armies that we know had at least 20 to 30,000 people, as far as the numbers that are given. And lots of other things that says numberless. So maybe it went up to 40,000, maybe numberless, like I think 25 is like the biggest number given. It might be a 30. We're talking before the time of Christ, when the armies get to be 50,000, right? After the time of Christ, but before. So how do you have a capital city that doesn't even have the population of your army? Like that just seems like wild to me. And yet they are always bashing on Heartlanders and saying there's not enough population in the Heartland. It's like, well, your capital city is beans too. Like, why are you making fun of them for that for? Because you got the same problem. Your city of Manti was like a teeny hamlet, and your cities along the East Sea are like almost non-existent. I mean, they had populations of like less than 1,000. So there's a lot of name calling back and forth on that when it's kind of like, well, check your own model first because you suffer from the same problem.
Yeah.
But I think that the city of Zarahemla, I'll just tell you my idea. When it comes to all the quotes in the Times and Seasons, which is its own entire discussion, right? Mm-hmm. And I totally respect it. Like any of those quotes, they could be something that Joe Smith had no clue about, or they could be things that he did know about. That's kind of like, we'll never know. It's kind of like the polygamy debate. There's so many things that are just in that land of not knowing, and your belief on it is going to be influenced by your perspective on the model, you know? But the first two are really interesting because the second one, where they really go off and they start to quote from Alexander Humboldt's book. Like, and if anyone hasn't actually because there's a version of that on archive.org, of Alexander Humboldt's book, where he goes and quotes Sigüenza and Ixtlilxochitl and all these early Spanish chronologers. And he just goes off over and over about these stories of the Aztec and Toltec migrations from Mesoamerica to where he says one of them in the Great Lakes region and another one kind of in the Arkansas latitude, he says.
Right.
And these guys in all their migration stories, they came up and they name the cities after the old cities. They call it like, so you got Chulan down south, and they come back and they name a city Chulanzingo. And Zingo is just kind of like a suffix meaning like New Jerusalem or New Zarahemla or Little Zarahemla specifically. And so they have like a capital of Tulan, and then they come up north and they form Tulancingo. And so then in my view, it's like, well, why did God tell Joseph Smith to name Zarahemla, even though there's no ruins there at all? You know, I mean, Wayne kind of is starting to claim that there's a mound there, but there's no like vindicated ruins at all. So why would he do that? He's like, well, he's trying to point to that same idea. God is actually telling them, just like they're quoting in the Times and Seasons, that is like, look, no, there's a Zarahemla up here. Like they came in and they migrated up here and they formed like a new Zarahemla up here. And I think I know where the actual city is. And same with the Manti. I think he's trying to point to the fact that it's like, well, people from near the city of Manti, they actually came to the land northward, and they are forming little communities up here after their migration. And so then that makes more sense to me than trying to assign a city to something where there aren't any ruins at all. But yeah, we're probably curious on your ideas, like as far as And I don't think you get weighed down on details. I think that you're more into like the general idea and just the amazing correspondences, and especially the quotes. But do you have thoughts on like the actual city of Zarahemla being
Sure.
where Joseph is said, or maybe there being a site somewhere?
Yeah, and well, and let me reiterate this idea of clarity, charity, and understanding, which leads to multiple working hypotheses. So I'm fine with lots of different variety, like you say. But as far as Zarahemla specifically, you know, when Lehi left Jerusalem, they say the population was about 25,000 people, even though it was a great city in Israel and so on. So when we think of cities in antiquity, they were not huge population centers. If even Jerusalem had only 25,000 people, then that can give us an idea of what the cities in the New World might have been like. But with regard to the one across from Nauvoo in DNC 125, it's interesting that it says, let the name of Zarahemla be placed upon it. Does that refer to Zarahemla, the individual, or to the city from, let's say in your case, from another location? And the Book of Mormon says they named their cities after the first person who founded them. So when I read that and it says, let the name of Zarahemla be put upon it, for me, that implies that that's where Zarahemla was. Okay. But I recognize there's alternative interpretations. As far as there not being any ruins there, you know, the first capital of Illinois was Kaskaskia, which was along the Mississippi River. And it was the largest city in Illinois in the early 1800s. But right now there's only a farm. I think there's 7 people that live on the farm there because it was flooded by the Mississippi River. In fact, it's not even in Illinois anymore. The course of the river changed, and now it's on the other side of the river. And that was the capital of Illinois, the first capital of Illinois. And so there's no city left there at all. And this is just within the last 200 years. So the way the Mississippi River can change course and flood cities and so on, to me, tells me anyway, that whether there was a city there in antiquity or not, we wouldn't expect to find it now. You've probably seen the videos of the steamboat Arabia. Are you guys familiar with that, or should I explain that real quick?
No, explain that.
Explain it, yeah.
Okay, if you ever go to Kansas City, downtown Kansas City, there's a museum, and it's a steamboat Arabia was the name of it, that was sailing on the Missouri River in the I guess it was the late 1800s, and it hit a snag in the river and sunk so fast that the people were just able to jump off. And I think there was one donkey that drowned because they couldn't untie him fast enough. But everything that was in the ship just sunk. They couldn't even rescue their whiskey or any of their stuff. And so these explorers had read about this account and they wanted to find it. They thought it'd be cool to dig up all the contents of this ancient, or not ancient, but the steamboat. And they were trolling up and down the river looking for it with their GPR and so on. And some farmer saw him and said, "What are you guys doing?" And he said, "Well, we're looking for this steamboat that sank." And he goes, "Oh, it's under my farm." And they said, "What?" And he said, "Yeah, when I bought this farm, the old boy told me that there was a steamboat buried under here. And it was a half a mile away from the river." And they went over there and they used their GPR and they hit a large metal piece, but it was down, I don't remember, I think it was 60 or 70 feet below the surface. And so they started digging and digging and digging. And sure enough, that's where the steamboat was. And they everything in there was intact, all the canned goods and the whiskey and the dishes and utensils and all that. And all this stuff is on display in Kansas City right now. And it's a fabulous museum. And it turns out, by the way, these guys are reorganized LDS, and I gave them a copy of the annotated Book of Mormon. But anyway, they realized that the amount of things that could be buried along the Mississippi River. I mean, here, this steamboat sunk only in the late 1800s, and it was a half a mile away underneath the farm. So we have no idea what's buried underneath the banks of the Mississippi River, especially from 2,000 years ago. So it doesn't, I think that the DNC 125 is a particularly interesting revelation. Early on, some of the scholars were saying, well, it was called Zarahemla before that revelation was given. But then upon more detailed research, they discovered no, the revelation was the first time it was named Zarahemla. And there were plans to build a temple on that site to face the temple in Nauvoo. So there would be temples facing each other on both sides. think it was Heber C. Kimball mentioned that. So there's a lot of significance to that site that we don't know much about. And again, it gets back to this idea, well, there's no known buildings on that site, but would we expect there to be?
Yeah.
I wouldn't expect to be.
Yeah, so many of these things are like unprovable,
Yeah, well,
because it is in the floodplain, and Nauvoo is in the floodplain, and Nauvoo could be totally flooded at any time. Totally.
But what I think is cool, well, this whole thing about Kaskaskia came up. I was doing a presentation on Nauvoo, and someone said, well, the original capital of Illinois doesn't even exist anymore because it was flooded out. But the interesting thing about that site in Zarahemla across from Nauvoo is it's in a lower area and it's surrounded by the higher plains. And they're always talking about going down into Zarahemla and up out of Zarahemla. And if you visit it today, that's exactly what you do. You still have to go up on the hill. The highway goes down into the lowland area and then up out of it if you leave. So that little detail is an example of what I think is pretty cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it'd be awesome if there were a buried city there, but I wouldn't expect there to be. Here's an interesting thing, though. And I don't have Google Earth open, or I could show you, but if you go north of there along the river, there's a massive earthworks that's never been excavated. It's being farmed right now, actually. And the state of Iowa archaeologists know about it. Wayne's talked to them about exploring it, and they've kind of said, well, we're not really working on it. I'd have to look at mine and see exactly where it is, but it's north of there. Well, okay, you can see there, that kidney shape.
Here somewhere.
Well, the one I'm talking about is much further up the river, but right here where your cursor is that kidney shape. Look, Montrose at the south, and then that upper part. Yeah, and if you had a topographical map, you would see that it goes down quite a bit there. And
you can definitely tell this is an old oxbow right here. So this is a floodplain for sure.
Yeah, but it's much lower in elevation, and so the question is, if there was a city there anciently, would it still be there? Very unlikely. The other interesting aspect of all this is, why would they have built a city there? And there you have to look at the topography of the Mississippi River, because you could sail or paddle, whatever you want to do, all the way up until you got to the rapids there. And then the rapids were so shallow, ships couldn't go. In fact, even in Nauvoo times, they used to have to dock a little below Montrose and then carry cargo over land to get above those rapids and then continue up towards Minnesota. And so you could walk across there on foot certain times of the year because it was so shallow. So it makes sense if, as according to our theory, if the Mulekites sailed up the Mississippi River, they couldn't go any further than there. So that would be the place where they stopped, which is just kind of a coincidence that's also where the DNC says Zarahemla, name the place Zarahemla.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a cool thing about my model. I mean, it's really one of the basic beliefs of mine, is that when the Book of Mormon talks about, especially when Mormon is coming down from the land northward after the time of Christ, and he says, and I saw that the people had spread about so that they're more than the sands of the sea, and I had such a grand picture in my mind when I first read that, of him coming down this valley, and there being so many people. And I think in my mind of you think of where the early New Englanders, they settled in New York, and where is all the population in America? It's really in New York, because that's where they first arrived. And so it just built up to be this huge place. And so I really see that in the Book of Mormon models too. And it's why I love kind of my model, where I have Zarahemla being, all the way from the Valley of Morelos, that's kind of the low area, and then extending up to the Mexican highland. A lot of archaeologists say, you can't put down your shovel in the Valley of Mexico without hitting an archaeological remain of some sort of pottery or something. And it's really true. There were millions of people there.
Well, it's true in Illinois too, though.
Well, but I mean, there's zero comparison, between Illinois and the Valley of Mexico, talking about Teotihuacan and Cholula, compared to even Cahokia, which is amazing. And Cahokia is part of my model, right? And it dates to 1000 AD. But it's that's the most impressive site in all of North America, and it's awesome. If people haven't been to Cahokia, go to Cahokia. It is such an amazing site.
Are we going to Cahokia on our trip, Lance?
It's in Illinois, right?
Oh,
yeah.
So this is along the Mississippi River. And it built up, like, so with all of these areas that go all the way from the southwest to western Mexico, even down in Tula. You have the Tula Falls, right, at like 1020 AD or something like that. And then you have this
Mm-hmm.
massive buildup in the Anasazi lands, and this huge population appears out of nowhere, and everyone urbanizes, whether they're coming from outside or coming internally. There's definitely external, like, overlords who come and they build everything up, and then the place, like, prospers for like 100 years and then collapses. And then the same thing happens to Cahokia and to Spyro and all these like mounds down around, Zarahemla. You have this massive buildup, and then it all collapses, and you see all these sacrifices, and there's all these women being sacrificed and thrown in the pit, and there's all this warfare going on. And then up in New York, where once again the Mayan people are always like, there's no evidence in New York of like of the battle. But it's like, that's totally not true. Like, get into some of the graduate theses, and you'll see there are so many huge burial mounds, and they all date from two periods. One is from the Hopewell collapse, right? So around 400 AD, you really do have like some kind of a collapse, and you've got a number of in New York. Like, I have a book that has like 72 different burial mounds, and some of them have up to like 300 bodies in them. And so the first one happens at the end of the Hopewell, but the second one happens with the fall of Cahokia and the Southwest cultures and Tula, right there at 1050 AD, which is the exact same time period that this Times and Seasons article with Alexander von Humboldt, when he's talking about the Aztecs or the Toltecs and how they come up north. And you've got, not only that, I like talked to someone just yesterday, Greg, who's talking about the Hopi and their legends. And they're like, well, we know that we came from down near Paquime in the Mayan lands. Like, we came from Mexico, and then we migrated up here with the three white brethren, and they all believe that they are somehow related to the Ammonites, right? And then you've got Chief Mitigah saying the exact kind of stuff. He's like talking about, we had this global empire, and it was stretching all the way from the Heartland down into Mesoamerica. And
Lance,
so
you're saying that the Hopi say that three white brothers led them northward,
and that they're still, not only that, they have a prophecy that they have to stay up on Wapkai Mesa until like the three white brothers come and tell them that they can move their settlement.
What?
Right. And there's even like Navajo Grandma, if you've seen her YouTube video, she's got the same thing where they're talking about, because you've got the Decalogue Stone and the Ten Commandments there in the Southwest. You've got Levi Hancock, Mosiah Hancock, all these early saints who are actually contemporaries of Joseph Smith with their Mormon's map, saying that they were going to retrace Mormons and Moronites' travels and go to where the Nephites lost their power. Like, there's so much awesome evidence of this continental model, and the Heartland is like such a vital, like such an important part of that. And it's just crazy for me to like watch kind of a lot of these Mayan land people completely dismiss it and look down on it when their models suffer from the exact same issues, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's the pot. Like, so one of my favorite parts, I'll just go over really quick, of the Book of Mormon geography, which I've tried to kind of show on my thing here. Like, you can see these cities where I've got Antipyra and Judah and Kumeni and Zeezrom and Moroni up to Mulek. And I don't know where to put those in the Heartland. I'd love to try and steelman this and just make the best model possible for a Heartlander. But the thing that I'm trying to capture is, let's see, in the Book of Mormon, if you go to Alma 50, right, this verse right here, 7 through 13, really, but in 10, he's talking about how the Moroni creates a new border. In fact, if you go to 7, you can see like right where he starts. It says, and the land of Nephi did run in a straight course from the east sea to the west. And it came to pass when Moroni had driven all the Lamanites out of the east wilderness, which was north of the lands of their own possession, he caused the inhabitants who were in the land of Zarahemla and the land round about, they should go forth into the east wilderness, even to the borders by the seashore. He also placed armies on the south and the borders of their possessions and caused them to erect fortifications. And thus he cut off all the strongholds, right? And he does it by the head of the river Sidon. And then he does it all the way over to the city, the formation of the new city of Moroni, which is by the East Sea. So hopefully, I mean, people ought to read every verse of this and see what he's saying. He says that Moroni creates a new border because they've been attacked. Moroni creates a new border between the Nephites and the Lamanites through the narrow strip of wilderness. And he says it goes from the West Sea to the East Sea. And then all the wars that we hear about with the stripling warriors and with the battles on the East Sea with the Amulonites and the Amalekites, or the Amulonites, they detail like all of these different cities that go along there's a set of them that are along the East Sea, and there's a set of them that go from the West Sea all the way to Manti, and then it connects Manti to Nephihah. So then if you've got like an internal model of the Book of Mormon, right? Like, you can see my internal model here. Like, that's why they always kind of draw this, because it talks about a West Sea. It talks about the city by the sea, right? When the stripling warriors go toward it and do the fake out, it talks about Manti. And there's these 2 verses, I have all the verses here, that connect Manti to Nephi-Ha. And we know that Nephi-Ha is by Moroni. And we know that when they go and they take Moroni, Moranton, Omner, all the way up to Bountiful, that those are along the East Sea. So then we have to be able to like picture in our mind, like where all these armies are going, you know? And
So
it's hard. Go ahead.
real quick before we wrap up, I want to show just this site that we saw on the way home when Trevor and Chad, Latter-day Chad.
This was you guys driving home from Missouri.
Yeah,
right?
we're driving home and we drive by a city that's called Mound City. And we went and got gas. We tried to find gas. And
where was it? What state?
It was in Missouri. It was only about maybe an hour and a half outside of Adirondack. And Latter-day Chad goes, I bet you there's mounds out here, bro. I bet you there's mounds. Right. And we're driving, and all of a sudden we see this literal pyramid. And it was a natural hill that you could tell people had terraced out. Right. And we start going through. Dave, do you have the one that is you can actually see the pyramid?
Yeah. So
there's a little view of it. And literally, this is just carved out terrace. There's nothing around here. Total farmland. Keep going. There's a couple better shots. I'm hoping you have them.
Yeah, I don't have all of them on here. We'll probably, this is a really good one. You can see 2 different mounds here, and both of them have ridges where you could just see 3 levels of a ridge right here. And
yeah, that doesn't look very good. That doesn't. Yeah,
I don't have all of them screenshotted. I just have a few that I sent to you and Shane. I have a whole video. I'm going to put it into a vlog.
You got to get Chad's
lost
pictures.
city Atlantis. Did you find any crystals?
No crystals. No crystals.
No crystal city.
Well, on this topic of the populations, there's the state archaeologist in New York at University of Buffalo. I was consulting with him because we were going to put some of his artifacts on display in our museum in Palmyra till COVID stopped it, which is a whole nother topic. But he has over 1 million artifacts that aren't even on display from Western New York.
1 million?
And I've been out with him on sites where he would just dig around the ground and pick up arrowheads and things and give them to me. I have them here in my collection. But he said, yeah, the Hopewell were up here, and he gave us a list of 30 or 40 Hopewell sites in Western New York that vanished around 400 AD. So that's one thing. The other thing is I was in the office of the state archaeologist in Illinois also, and on his wall he has a map of all the archaeological sites in Illinois, and there are these red lines going across. And we asked him, are you saying that these ancient people were building in straight lines? And he laughed and he said, no, those are where we build highways, because everywhere we dig, we dig up material. Yeah. And he said that basically the entire state is full of artifacts. We just show the red lines because when we dig a highway, we have to document everything. And I've heard of people, I haven't talked to them myself, but I've heard secondhand that highway workers, when they're working on a project, and they dig up bones and artifacts, they don't tell the boss, because if they do, then they have to stop work and they're out of work until the archaeologists come in. So they just bury the stuff rather than tell their boss about it. So and we know that, or at least according to that book 1491, that somewhere 95% of the Indians that lived here were killed from smallpox and the other diseases. So it was a massive population in North America as well.
Yeah.
Even into Western New York.
Yeah, there definitely is a lot of evidence of burial mounds and stuff there. People don't ever let anyone say no. And then the other argument I wanted to hit as far as that goes is don't let anyone say that because the Hill Camorra is a glacial drumlin, to say that it can't have a room inside of it. That's silly. People don't even actually understand what a drumlin is, obviously. What part of it is going to be bedrock and then part of it's going to be scree. But
yeah, I was going to ask.
Well, I've actually.
Go ahead.
Well, okay. So I don't know if you knew that we bought that farm out in Palmyra and explored it and so on. But I've actually dug into some of those moraines with a backhoe because, again, I'm curious about stuff. And I went down about 4 or 5 feet, and it's fairly loose material. It's not completely loose, but then we hit solid clay. And there's cave networks all through Western New York. In fact, in Rochester, there's a big tourist attraction, and further east, there's a big tourist attraction where you can go into these big caves that are in underground there. And so, it is kind of funny when they say it's just a pile of rubble, because I've dug into myself, and I can tell you they're not a pile of rubble. There's at least a clay base. Maybe I didn't go down further than about 7 or 8 feet, so there may be rock underneath there. But
yeah, the leading edge would have rock on it, and then the trailing edge would have sand, gravel, and maybe boulders and stuff like that. But even in the sand and gravel, there's probably going to be calcified areas that you could dig something out. But definitely in the bedrock. In fact, the bedrock layer has gypsum deposits. It would make for easy natural caves and dug caves.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the overview on Google Maps of the place we went. Latter-day Chad just sent me his images because we started zooming out and just seeing all of these weird things. But look at this. This is the terraced hill. And
that's Atlantis. That is fully Atlantis. Look at that.
Like, that's wild, right? Just in the middle of nowhere. Nobody has any interest in this whatsoever.
Yeah.
Like, people are like, eh. There was 3 of them.
I went to one like that with Wayne up in Wisconsin too, and you can see it from a distance. It's massive and huge, and there's just not time to explore all these.
Is anybody trying to excavate these mounds? Does anybody like dig them out to see if they're just a pyramid that's covered up by dirt? And
I'm sure a farmer dug that, and so it probably has been excavated. It's like when you get on Google Earth and you start looking for pyramids, like balancing pyramids, and all of a sudden every seamount becomes a pyramid. Like, check it out. There's a pyramid there. There's a pyramid there. There's a pyramid there.
Like, well, this was, and I we didn't have any illusion that it was a pyramid, but what it clearly was this thing had been carved out and terraced long time ago. Like, there's farmland everywhere there, right? But yet somebody took the time to, without backhoes and excavators, someone anciently took the time to carve and terrace these things out. And it's just like, to what extent? Like, what were they doing there? Because there's flat land with nothing on it everywhere. So it's not like in China, in some of those areas that are mountainous, and they need to use these different plateaus for farming because they don't have flat land. There's flat land everywhere. And why would you go to all of that effort? The only thing that comes to mind for me is some religious, aspect. So,
well, this is all fascinating, and I feel like we need to do. We like barely scratched the surface today with Lance and Jonathan. So I feel like we need to have another part 2 to just continue to do this. It's amazing. Time flies when you're talking Book of Mormon. And if we didn't have a hard stop, we'd keep going. We've gone 1 hour and 42 minutes, believe it or not. Is how long this has gone. So we have another podcast we got to jump to. Jonathan, would you be open to coming on again if we schedule another time?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I really love Lance's approach, where he's kind of starting with a blank sheet and just analyzing the evidence from wherever it comes from. I admire that, and I think it's fantastic. It's one of the best in terms of multiple working hypotheses. This is one of the best. So.
Yeah, and before
Jonathan
we go,
has so much good stuff that we haven't got to, so we definitely need to on again because he only scratched the surface.
My biggest takeaway is CCU. Can you
clarity, charity, and understanding?
That's right.
Good.
That's right.
Good.
So
Love
thank you for that. I think it's important that we remember CCU as we have any discussions, especially with our own people. And it's okay. Yeah. It's okay for Mitt Romney to not vote for Donald Trump. I mean, barely okay, but it's okay. We got to let him decide that he's going to do that. And it's okay for Mike Lee to support Mitt Romney, and both can be right, because we all get to have our own opinions. We all chose to come and have this experience where agency exists, and we have to be respectful of what other people believe, and we have to be okay to have somebody say, hey, we're going to have to agree to disagree, and let it go. And part of what Zion Media's goal is to create unity, because if we can't create unity, we will never create Zion. And our hope is that we can find a way to be okay with saying, well, I don't see it that way, but still see eye to eye with somebody. So Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on. Lance, we love you, big dog. Excited to go to Mexico with you and see these ancient sites. And again, for those of you who are interested, we are going to be planning another trip to Mexico. This is like the trip before we do another trip. And listen, our goal isn't to necessarily make money on any of this stuff. Like, I've got a job I'm taking care of. Trevor's got a job he's taking care of. Well, David, that's another story. But our goal is to go do cool stuff and have everybody kind of pay for themselves. And if we can cover the costs and we break even, like, that's the goal. When we do these events at Morrell Ranch, our goal is to cover the costs of those people who can't cover their own costs. And so we appreciate all of the donations that came in. And I promise you, huge, rich blessings, Malachi type blessings being poured out from heaven as you help people like David the Lion Douglas or Chief Mitiga. So thank you for extending some of your surplus to help them and help David. David, because of your generosity, is now able to come on the trip to Mexico, which he never in his life thought he would be able to travel to Mexico. And he loves this stuff. I'll tell you what, I'm not super excited to go to Mexico. I don't really like this archaeology stuff. Like, unless there's a golf course involved, I'm not interested. So I'm hoping we find some golf courses down there, then I'll be excited to go. But other than that, I'm more excited to hang out with Lance and David and Trevor and David Gutierrez and who are the other people that are coming? There's that couple that's coming.
The Fieldings.
Yeah, the Fieldings. The other one that's coming.
Lily.
Like, I'm excited just to hang out with you guys, have great conversation. And, I've never been to Mexico. I mean, I've been to Mexico on a cruise. That's really not Mexico. I've been to Tijuana, but I'm excited to go and see Nephi's temple. That's right, Monte Alban. And
we'll do the Heartland next too. We'll do Cahokia and Spiro and Etowah and all the awesome Heartland stuff. And then we got to get Jonathan to come with us.
And we might even go find the white Nephite. So pray for us. But Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time with us. We will schedule another one again because I love your approach to this stuff, especially as an attorney. When we divest ourselves from all intellectual pride, we open ourselves up to truth. Right. It's the hardest thing for human beings to do, to divest yourself from bias. We all have this bias, and it's a really hard thing to do. But when you can set your bias on the shelf and be open to other people's thoughts and ideas, be amazed at what you can learn when you do that. So for myself, I'm Shane Baldwin. For Trevor the Keys, David the Lion Douglas, our guest Lance Weaver, and the man Jonathan Neville. We'll see you guys all next time.
Thanks a lot.